Somewhere outside Pittsburgh in the late summer of 2002, Mike Webster is sitting in a pickup truck on the side of the road. He doesn't know how to get home. He picks up the phone and calls someone in his family. "All I see is trees," he tells them. His voice is quiet and a little bit ashamed, the way a person sounds when they know something is badly wrong inside them and don't have the words for what it is. You need to understand who Mike Webster was before you understand what this means. He was the center for the Pittsburgh Steelers from 1974 to 1988. 4 Super Bowls, 9 Pro Bowls, 5 times first team All-Pro. He was the anchor of one of the most dominant offensive lines in NFL history, the engine of a dynasty. Terry Bradshaw called him our strength. When Webster was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1997, he walked into the ceremony to a standing ovation. He's 50 years old and he can't find his way home from the side of a road outside Pittsburgh. In 2 weeks, he'll be dead. And the disease that killed him doesn't have a name yet. Mike Webster spent 17 seasons in the NFL. Before his mind started failing, he'd estimated that he'd played the equivalent of 7 players' careers. Thousands of collisions per season, helmet to helmet, the kind that makes a sound you can hear from the upper deck. Center was the position that absorbed the most hits from the most angles because the center's job was to snap the football and then immediately put himself between the quarterback and every person on the other side of the line trying to reach him. When Webster retired in 1990, the damage wasn't visible. That's the thing about this disease. It moves quietly for years before it announces itself. The memory problems crept in slowly. Small things at first, then bigger ones. He lost his money and couldn't track the details well enough to fix it. His marriage fell apart. He spent nights in the Pittsburgh bus terminal, then in his truck. His oldest son, Colin, said later that the best way he could describe what was happening was that his father was slowly disappearing from inside himself, still physically enormous, still recognizably Mike Webster, but increasingly hollow behind the eyes. In 1999, the NFL awarded Webster a disability payment for traumatic brain injury. He was 47 years old. 3 years later, he was gone. On September 28, 2002, 4 days after Webster died of a heart attack in a Pittsburgh hospital, his body arrived at the Allegheny County Coroner's Office. It was a Saturday. The pathologist on call was a 34-year-old Nigerian-born doctor named Bennet Omalu. He knew absolutely nothing about football. He'd grown up in Nigeria, and the first time he'd seen NFL players on American television, he thought they'd looked like astronauts heading to another planet, all that padding and headgear. He had no emotional attachment to the game, no stake in what it meant to Pittsburgh. He was just a pathologist doing his job. He looked at the body of Iron Mike Webster, this enormous, otherwise apparently healthy 50-year-old man, and felt that something didn't add up. He told his assistant to preserve the brain. His assistant looked at him. Webster had died of heart failure. Why would they study the brain? Omalu just repeated himself. Preserve it. Over the following months, he worked on Webster's brain tissue at home, waking up at 2 in the morning to go over microscope slides he'd bought out of his own pocket. What he found was something no one had ever described in a football player. Massive deposits of a protein called tau, threading through the brain in a pattern associated with severe dementia in patients decades older than 50. Webster's brain, under Omalu's microscope, looked like it belonged to a man of 70. In 2005, he published his findings in the peer-reviewed journal Neurosurgery. He named the condition chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, and described it as a progressive degenerative disease caused directly by repeated head trauma. He thought the NFL would be grateful for the discovery. He thought they'd want to protect their players. He was badly wrong about what was coming. The NFL had been thinking about the concussion question since 1994, when Commissioner Paul Tagliabue created a body officially known as the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee. The name is worth pausing on. They took one of the most serious injury categories a human brain can sustain and put the word mild right in the title. The man Tagliabue chose to run this committee was a doctor named Elliot Pellman. Pellman was a rheumatologist, a specialist in joints and connective tissue. He had no background in brain research. He was also the team doctor for the New York Jets, and it would later come out that Pellman was Tagliabue's personal physician as well. To chair the committee responsible for investigating the long-term neurological effects of professional football, the commissioner had chosen a man with no relevant expertise in the organ being studied and a personal and professional relationship with the commissioner himself. From 2003 to 2010, Pellman's committee published 16 papers in a peer-reviewed medical journal. Those papers said that concussions in NFL players weren't a serious long-term problem, that players recovered quickly, that returning to play in the same game after a concussion didn't significantly increase the risk of further injury. Independent neurologists and sports medicine researchers reached the opposite conclusions consistently. The NFL's institutional weight was substantial, and it promoted its own research aggressively. When Omalu published his findings on Webster in 2005, the league came at him directly. Its doctors demanded his paper be retracted. NFL representatives worked to publicly discredit his credentials and his methodology. One NFL doctor met with Omalu in person and reportedly asked him, "Do you know what you're doing to us? Not to the players, to us, the league, the brand, the billions." Omalu wasn't a U.S. citizen yet. His visa status depended on staying employed. The pressure on him was real and sustained. He didn't retract a single word. The campaign continued for years. When Boston University's CTE research team, led by a neuropathologist named Ann McKee, was building a major new study, the NFL pledged to fund it. Then the league quietly withdrew, citing concerns about the lead researcher's impartiality. The National Institutes of Health had to step in with $16 million to cover what the league had promised. In 2016, an NFL official testified before Congress and acknowledged, for the first time on the record, that there is a link between playing professional football and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. That was 14 years after Omalu had found it in Mike Webster's brain. And while the NFL was running that operation, something was happening on the other side of the world that would eventually connect to the same disease, the same denial, and the same institutional calculus. The most common weapon used against American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan from 2001 onward was the improvised explosive device, the IED. You've heard that term before if you've been watching this channel, but what matters for this story isn't the explosion itself, it's the pressure wave. When an IED detonates, it doesn't just produce fire and fragmentation, it produces a blast overpressure event, a wave of compressed air that travels faster than the speed of sound and passes through everything in its path: walls, vehicle armor, the human body, and the brain inside the skull. The military had understood for decades that blast waves were dangerous to the lungs. Lungs are air-filled and vulnerable. Medical doctrine going into Iraq and Afghanistan held that the brain was more protected, encased in bone, insulated by fluid. That turned out to be wrong. When a blast wave moves through the skull, the brain shifts and stretches inside it in ways it wasn't designed to tolerate. No fracture, no bleeding, nothing visible on a standard CT scan. The person gets up, shakes their head, maybe has a headache for a few hours, and goes back to the mission. Because in a combat zone, you go back to the mission. That's the culture. That's the expectation. And for years, nobody was telling them to do otherwise, because the institution hadn't acknowledged that there was anything to worry about. TBI became known as the signature wound of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Estimates put the rate among returning veterans at between 10 and 20%. Hundreds of thousands of cases across a military that deployed millions of people over 2 decades. The Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center eventually tracked nearly 350,000 individual TBI diagnoses, but researchers who looked harder found that the real number was higher. Before 2007, the military wasn't systematically screening service members for TBI at all. An investigation by ProPublica and NPR found that tens of thousands of cases had simply gone uncounted. Some soldiers were denied the Purple Heart for concussion injuries because some commanders didn't consider a concussion a real wound. The military didn't need an Elliot Pellman. The denial was structural. It was built into the culture of toughness that makes the institution function. You don't report symptoms because reporting means leaving your unit. Leaving your unit means letting down the people depending on you. So you push through. You take the hit and keep going. That's what soldiers do. That's what they've always done. The problem is that the institution knew, or should have known, that what they were being asked to absorb was doing lasting damage. And knowing it would have required changing things. In 2017, at the height of the campaign against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, Marine artillery crews were being asked to do something that hadn't been demanded of American artillery since Vietnam. They were firing continuously, around the clock, day after day, in support of coalition forces grinding through ISIS-held cities. The rate of fire was extraordinary. Some batteries fired tens of thousands of rounds in a single deployment. The operational demand was so intense that at least 2 of their M777 howitzers burned out from the sheer volume of rounds fired through them. Here's what matters about that. The M777 is a 155mm artillery piece. When it fires, the explosive charge that launches the round also generates a massive blast overpressure event directly behind the gun. Every crew member standing near it absorbs that wave. Not an enemy weapon, their own gun. And when you fire that gun tens of thousands of times in the span of a few months, you're subjecting the same crew members to tens of thousands of blast events, each one sending a pressure wave through their skulls. After extended fire missions, Marines were walking around in a daze. Some of them were bleeding from the ears. The disorientation was obvious enough that their fellow Marines noticed. But the mission was ongoing. The rounds were needed, and the culture said, you keep going. The Marine Corps commissioned an internal study the following year. What they found was damning. More than half the members of one battery had been diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. A Corps review of another unit confirmed that after firing an unusually high number of rounds, those Marines suffered a TBI rate significantly higher than the rest of the artillery community. The review noted, almost as a footnote, that knowledge of how to reduce blast overpressure was extremely limited, and that the long-term effects on those men were seemingly ignored. The study sat in Marine Corps files. In the years after those batteries came home, at least one member of each unit ended their own lives. Others reported nightmares, panic attacks, depression, and in some cases hallucinations. Some went to military medical channels seeking help and were told their symptoms didn't qualify as service-related injuries. The Pentagon had commissioned the study. Nobody moved quickly to change the doctrine. Nobody moved quickly to get those men treatment. Ryan Larkin was a Navy SEAL. He did multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan and performed the work that SEALs perform, the kind that doesn't make it into press releases. Over years of service, the exposures accumulated. Blast overpressure from firing his own weapons across hundreds of missions, from breaching charges, from training that included high-speed boat operations that slammed the hull against swells hard enough to rattle teeth and compress spines. The toll wasn't from a single dramatic explosion. It was quieter than that, and it built up across years without a visible wound. Ryan Larkin took his own life. His father, Frank Larkin, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in early 2024. Frank had been a Secret Service agent. He was composed and direct in the way people are when they've had time to organize grief into something they can carry into a room. He told the committee what happened to his son. Not from an enemy, not from a single catastrophic event, but from the cumulative physical cost of years of doing what the military asked Ryan to do, using the weapons the military issued him. Around the same time, a Defense Department laboratory made a finding that should have been front-page news. The DoD Brain Tissue Repository, established in 2012, funded by the Pentagon, housed at a military university, had been studying the brains of Navy SEALs who died by self-harm. Researchers found a distinctive pattern of microscopic damage called interface astroglial scarring. It's not CTE. It's not PTSD. It doesn't appear from a single large explosion. It appears specifically in people who have been exposed repeatedly to blast overpressure over time. Dr. Daniel Pearl, who leads the repository, described it plainly. For the first time, we could actually see the injury. The vast majority of the blast exposure that created that pattern hadn't come from enemy action. It had come from the SEALs firing their own weapons. And here's the detail that should stop you. Until the New York Times reported of the findings and directly contacted the Navy had not been informed that those findings existed. A Department of Defense laboratory studying the brains of Navy SEALs had identified a pattern of injury that was killing those SEALs, and the branch that employed them, that sent them on those missions, that issued them those weapons, had no idea. Let me tell you what Dr. Ann McKee does. McKee is the director of neuropathology for the VA's Boston healthcare system and the director of Boston University's CTE Center. She's published more than 70% of all confirmed CTE cases ever reported anywhere in the world. She's built the world's largest brain bank studying head trauma, over 1,000 brains, over 600 confirmed cases of CTE, drawn from athletes and military veterans. She doesn't separate those two populations when she talks about what she finds. In 2017, she said it plainly. The parallels between connective injury and contact sports athletes and blast and concussive injury in veterans aren't merely suggestive. They're direct. The same protein, the same pattern, the same progressive destruction of cognitive function, emotional regulation, and at the far end, the will to stay alive. Both institutions knew this was coming for years before they acknowledged it. The NFL's story ended in a settlement. In 2015, a federal judge gave final approval to a deal covering more than 20,000 former players, expected to cost the league approximately $1 billion over 65 years. The league never admitted liability. The settlement specifically excluded future CTE claims, meaning the science that McKee and Omalu had spent their careers building was not part of what the players were compensated for. Because the case settled before trial, the NFL, in all likelihood, never had to disclose internal documents showing what it knew and when. The players got checks. The institution closed the book. The Pentagon's response played out on a longer timeline. Policies were issued and not implemented. Blast monitoring equipment wasn't provided to special operations forces. Weapons known to deliver shock waves above established safety thresholds stayed in active use. The Marine Corps had conducted its own internal study on the Syria batteries, found what it found, and the knowledge didn't translate quickly into changed operating procedures or medical monitoring for the men who'd been exposed. In 2024, more than 20 years after the first IEDs started going off under American vehicles in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Department of Defense updated its formal guidance on blast overpressure protection. It began requiring cognitive assessments for service members in high exposure roles. 2024. The science was never the problem. Omalu published in 2005. McKee's team was publishing throughout the 2010s. The Marine Corps had its own internal data. The DoD Brain Tissue Repository had been cataloging veteran brains since 2012. The knowledge existed. What took 20 plus years was getting the institution to act on it. And that gap, between the evidence and the response, is not a gap that can be explained by ignorance. Both the NFL and the military are built around the idea that the mission comes first, and that the bodies required to complete the mission are a cost of doing business. Neither institution failed to know that its people were being harmed. Both institutions made a calculation that acknowledging the harm was more expensive than continuing to let it happen. You've seen this pattern on this channel before. Agent Orange, burn pits, Camp Lejeune. The institution doesn't deny the harm because the harm is invisible. It denies the harm because acknowledging the harm creates obligations the institution doesn't want to meet. Mike Webster died confused and lost, calling his family from the side of the road he couldn't find his way home from. 4 Super Bowls, Hall of Fame, 17 years of giving the NFL everything his body had to give. When the usefulness was gone, the institution that had built $1 billion product on the backs of men like him spent 14 years fighting the science that might have explained what happened. Ryan Larkin took his own life. His father flew to Washington to sit in the Senate chamber and explain what the weapons Ryan had fired in service to his country had done to Ryan's brain. The lab that found the evidence had been funded by the Department of Defense. The Navy hadn't even been told. Neither of them was weak. Neither of them failed to be tough enough. They were failed by the institutions they trusted to be straight with them about what the work cost. The science wins eventually. It always does. But there's a gap between when the first bodies start accumulating and when the institution finally says out loud what it's been sitting on. And that gap has a cost. It has names and faces and families who know the exact shape of what they lost and can't get back. What you can do from the outside is refuse to let the settlement be the end of the story. Refuse to let the updated policy guideline be the headline when the headline should be the 20 years of inaction that came before it. This is what history is for. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment. Let me know which episode from this channel hits closest to home for you. And I'll see you in the next one.
Oh, Dave.